Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a Gameweek 18 free hit draft, and this is obviously an interesting piece of strategy that I suggested many weeks back, but a lot of things have, for example, derailed at least my plans of going for Gameweek 18, and part of that, of course, was the Mbumo injury, and of course, let's say the Haaland injury at the bare minimum. So right now, of course, I think not too many managers will be thinking about Gameweek 18 free hit, but if you're, let's say, a manager who's actually kept Haaland in your team and is waiting for him to come back on Gameweek 19, and you have players like, let's say, Alvarez and Foden, or you've been investing into, let's say, for example, Brentford players as well. You have, let's say, Flecken as your goalkeeper. You might not have Areola coming back this week as well. You know, it might be the case that you actually have 4 or 5 or even 6 players who are suspended. And usually we like to say that a free hit is probably worth at least, 10 plus points in terms of how it can actually impact your team positively compared to what your team would be if it was just to naturally roll, or if you had, for example, applied transfers already and would compare it to the ideal free hit team. So right now, I'd say in terms of Game Week 18, it's still a good strategy for those who are in the specific situation where they would stand to benefit prospectively that sort of 10 to 15 points or even 20 points. And so my strategy choice for free at 18 is to really target the teams who obviously have great fixtures, and obviously to avoid, majorly speaking, of course, Liverpool and Arsenal players who, of course, have a very tough game in hand. As far as the defense, if we're starting to build from the back, I think that your goalkeeper really should be between, let's say, Dubravka and Leno. And part of that is because they actually have the sort of best clean sheet odds for this week specifically. Ultimately, Fulham have a home game, and Newcastle are one of the best defenses in the league, but of course are playing away from home, and that makes it very different. So that sort of balances things between both Leno and Dubravka. For Leno, what we can say is that he actually has been a very positive shot stopper, and this is historically the case. Leno actually is one of the better shot stoppers in the Premier League. And if you're looking at clean sheets for this week, it's definitely between Aston Villa, Fulham, and Newcastle. Aston Villa, for me, actually have the best fixture by far. But because they have the best fixture by far, it makes more sense to spend more money in the Aston Villa players who actually probably have a higher ceiling in terms of expected points. And so we're talking about players who are probably going to be leading the line for this Aston Villa team. Watkins, of course, no doubt will feature as part of this draft, but you get the gist. And that's why I don't have, for example, Emi Martinez recommended as an Aston Villa option here at this time. So it makes sense for me to actually target either Fulham or Newcastle, assuming that you probably won't be tripling up on either Fulham or Newcastle in this draft selection. As far as, let's say, rounding out the team from the defensive point of view, like moving on beyond the boring goalkeepers, we have actually attacking fullbacks once again this week that I think would be worth actually targeting. And then also a sort of central defense option that I think is still good to sort of pick in terms of rounding out the sort of 3 defenders that you actually have. Right now, I've actually selected or elected to pick Pau Torres, but you can obviously change Pau Torres with Konsa as well, because Pau Torres did come off apparently in the last few minutes of the game, as per Emery, due to a small knock, and it really depends on, let's say, what Emery actually confirms before the game week starts. If, let's say, Emery actually confirms that Pau has a small injury and he won't be a part of the Sheffield United squad, I think it makes a lot of sense to just go for Konsa instead. As far as, let's say, players like Cash, players like Moreno, and players like Dean, I know there seems to be a lot of attacking upside from these fullbacks, but the big thing here is you're going for a free hit, and you also want guarantees. I think the guarantee here is that Aston Villa are probably one of these sort of better teams to target, and for that reason, I would probably actually go instead for a player like Pau Torres as well. Someone who, of course, actually has pretty good expected goal per 90 as a center back, and could, of course, be a big set piece threat compared to, let's say, some of the other options in other teams. As far as, let's say if you wanted to go with Emi Martinez as your goalkeeper, I think you could obviously go with, let's say, someone like Robinson instead from Fulham. So for me, it also depends on, let's say, what your goalkeeper option is. I think it's just more interesting to probably go with the outfield player as well from Aston Villa, where I would say there's more expected points for them, and that's simply where I would sort of land. Pau Torres right now and Leno as your sort of boring staple players for the defense. But in terms of the attacking fullbacks, I think it's very easy to go with Trippier and Pedro Porro. These are both players who are right backs for their teams, both players who ultimately are on a multitude of set pieces. Pedro Porro on a slightly less amount of set pieces than Trippier. But of course, the attacking upside of set pieces. We've seen plenty of Pedro Porro assists as of late. We've seen plenty of games from Trippier where he's gotten 12 points, 9 points. And that simply comes down to how many chances he's actually consistently building through crosses, through open play, and through those set pieces in particular for Trippier's case. So with Pedro Porro, I would say the big thing here is you're just looking at attacking upside. Udogie is out, so obviously that sort of, in my opinion, actually worsens the overall attacking quality of this Tottenham team, but it doesn't really take away from what Pedro Porro brings to the table. He's definitely someone who is just incredibly attacking if you've ever been able to watch Tottenham this season. As far as Trippier, he's just a very consistent piece of this Newcastle defense. I think there's absolutely no worries about him starting, unless, let's say, there's an EFL Cup situation and Trippier actually seemingly is injured, which probably is unlikely. But as I said, Trippier just makes a lot more sense as an option. As far as the actual midfield here, there's a lot more flexibility in terms of the choices that you can actually go with here in the midfield. And I think part of that, of course, is the question of whether you want to sort of play it a little bit more safe by owning someone like Salah this week, or whether you actually want to go with much more differentials for the team for the time being. I think it still makes sense to go with Salah. And part of the reason, of course, is we know that Salah is one of the absolute best players in the game. We also know that from an underlying stats point of view, that he is really one of the few midfielders who actually doesn't have an equal. And so in the context that Salah has an incredibly tough game, I think he's the one player from Liverpool that I would definitely be suggesting, or even the one player between the Liverpool and Arsenal game that I would be suggesting to actually include as part of your free hit draft. If you're looking particularly to, let's say, go for differentials only, and you actually want to drop Salah from your draft for that same reason, then I think it does make sense to actually move away from Salah into, let's say, potentially a Fulham midfielder, and you could even double up on the Fulham midfield instead. And for this reason, of course, I'm going to be suggesting, as I said, Salah, because I still think he makes sense in most game weeks, really, unless he's, let's say, facing City away, where a lot of people probably still wouldn't bench him. And I'm going to be recommending Bailey as probably my best differential here for this midfield draft. Ultimately, Bailey came on as a super sub versus Brentford, and part of the reason why I think he actually came on as a sub was because Unai Emery probably saw it as an opportunity to actually give Diaby another chance to sort of fight for his spot in the team, another chance, for example, to sort of operate with that structure where he actually plays Matty Cash. As I said, I don't think there's any guarantees with Matty Cash, and I think there's actually even a guarantee that he probably won't start for Sheffield United at home. I own Matty Cash, and I've been owning Matty Cash so that I could actually play him for Sheffield United at home, and that sort of small little possibility, in my opinion, has been extinguished, simply because the team actually plays a lot better when, let's say, Diaby isn't playing as a second forward, and when they actually have more midfielders effectively within the team. So I think that Bailey will definitely start. He only probably was a super sub because of the knock that he actually faced in Gameweek 16, which meant that this was, as I said, a good chance to play potentially Diaby ahead of him. Zaniolo is someone who could even take the position of Cash, let's say, if you wanted to see the team stay within the same sort of structure. And as I said, for those reasons and those reasons alone, it doesn't make sense that Bailey would be sort of missing from this fixture. I think Bailey would definitely start, and he was also a big part of why Aston Villa were able to come back versus Brentford and actually get those 3 points. So I think Bailey would definitely start. Douglas Luiz, of course, is another differential that you can actually go with. But as I said, it still makes sense for me to actually consolidate with 3 defenders, with one of the Aston Villa defense at least as part of the draft. So I would actually go with, as I said, one of the defenders. If you wanted to double up on the Aston Villa midfield, you of course have Douglas Luiz as an option as well. But he won't be a part of this draft. I will have Son and Richarlison definitely as the 2 players who actually round out the triple crown of Spurs. And so I think with Richarlison, you can actually say that his minutes in the team are definitely the most diciest in terms of the options that I've suggested. But Kulusevski is probably that sort of big counterpoint where you can say he's obviously had some great games lately. 1 goal, 1 assist in 2 big games, for example, the City game and recently, of course, for Nottingham Forest. What I would say still is that Kulusevski's underlying stats are still very, very poor. He's not on set pieces, or not on set pieces, but rather not on penalties like Son is. And so I would like to still back Son in this instance here. And since Richarlison is a centre forward who actually is getting most of those chances and his underlying stats still look incredible, I would actually still back Richarlison over Kulusevski as well. So those are the 2 options that I would actually go with. Clearly, as I said, Kulusevski is a differential that you can consider. As far as, let's say, rounding out the midfield here, I would go with Andreas here in this instance, just because I think with Willian, the issue is that he has been rotated and he has been sort of dropped from the squad in recent memory. And part of that is maybe because at his age, of course, he's not able to actually play the amount of games that that Fulham actually have. But my concern really is that good enough really to, for example, recommend him into a free hit draft, even though he is the penalty taker prospectively for this Fulham team? Because, of course, Raul Jimenez is out, suspended himself. And now you're looking at, let's say, between Andreas and Willian, Andreas obviously being the penalty taker where Willian is out. And so in that context, I think Willian is probably slightly better if you were able to guarantee a start. But because I can't guarantee a start and I'm not sure exactly, what Willian's importance is to the team right now, I just think that Andreas gives you much more tangible guarantees. And so Andreas is the player that I would recommend. Although, as I said, if you really think that Willian will definitely start, he might actually be the better punt between, let's say, himself and Andreas for one singular fixture. And then in terms of the forward position, I think this is a question, once again, of your risk appetite as a player. and as an FPL manager. In my opinion, I think Watkins is an absolutely no doubt of an option, and Solanke is probably the next best option. As far as the third forward, though, who could actually feature in this draft, it's going to be the Newcastle forward. And part of that is because with the EFL Cup fixture that will actually happen midweek, we will, and we really should be able to find out who's actually going to play in that fixture, and if, let's say, Isaac is truly fit and available. Because one thing that Eddie Howe did actually mention to us was that he said that Isaac was actually fully rested on purpose for Game Week 17. And so our assumption is actually probably going to be that whoever plays in the EFL Cup fixture between the two of them, and whoever is actually sitting on the bench on that EFL Cup game, should be starting away versus Luton Town. And so from that point of view, I think you can actually maybe suggest that, let's say, Solanke is worth benching, and that whoever actually you think will start between, let's say, Isaac and Wilson could be worth starting over Solanke in a 3-5-2 template. Otherwise, as I said, I think it makes a lot more sense to go with the safer option that is Solanke if you can't make that decision. Particularly if, let's say, you think that, let's say, if Isaac's fit and ready to play for Game Week 18, or if Wilson's fit and ready to play for Game Week 18, that one of them could be also subbed off quite early. And so in that context, I think it makes more sense to trust in Solanke instead, and to actually have a draft in a 3-5-2 template like so. That's going to be the sort of straight 18 draft. In terms of captaincy, I think there's absolutely no doubts either between Watkins and Son. My preference is to go and target the absolute easiest fixture in the league. I'm potentially also looking at my team and reflecting from last week where we just saw Palmer absolutely destroy Sheffield United at home, and I sort of went for Salah instead. And that's something to even think about as well. Ultimately, Watkins has that fixture, and Watkins has the 90 minutes that we know we all love from FPL players, and so no concerns really with Watkins. I think I would be absolutely going with Watkins captaincy here with Son vice captain. And that's going to be the free at 18 draft. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.